Hi, this is Juan Duque for aetutsplus.com. This tutorial will show you how to fake the look of a homemade stop-motion animation using 3D Max and After Effects. Basically, it's to turn a regular looking animation like this into a more choppy, kind of jumpy, homemade looky stop-motion animation, which is actually not stop-motion. In the description you can find links to real-world examples for some commercials we did for a supermarket chain called El Rey in Panama. But let me show you a couple of them. This is one. Basically it's like kind of like an American Idol audition thing for bread and fruits and vegetables and stuff, and the client wanted that look of stop motion, but he was looking for that homemade look that characterizes the stop motion of past years when they didn't have the technology to make it look as smooth as some of the Aardman animations look now, like Chicken Run and stuff like that. So basically we needed to make it look homemade, and what gives away a homemade stop motion animation is a couple of things. First, there's poor planning. So when you don't plan ahead while doing stop motion, the curves are going to be linear. You're not going to have ease in or ease out. Everything is very linear. Also, since it's sometimes hastily made, there's going to be choppy motion, because instead of being patient and doing 24 frames per second or 30 frames per second, you might have 8 frames per second, 12 frames per second. The frame rate varies. And lastly, since it's not professional, so there's no miniature sets or equipment, every time somebody moves a character or the set, there might be light variations because the lights are not professional, and the camera position variations because they might budge the camera while moving the characters. So let's get started. Let me show you the 3D Max scene. This is the scene. Rather than going from scratch, because this is mostly an After Effects tutorial, I'll show you quickly the scene setup for this lump of clay kind of crawling forward and then like collapsing. This is a very simple scene. Geometry is for the stage. Let me hide the lump of clay. I have a floor, I have a wall trim thingy here. Very simple V-Ray light. And for my setup, I'm using V-Ray with GI on, and I have a very simple environment map, which is this HDRI looking image that I found online. I googled HDRI and this came up, and I used it. Now, I'm not an expert at lighting, but you should try to make this look as real as possible, because it'll help with the illusion that it's actually a stop motion animation and not 3D. So for the lump of clay, let me show you here. First, I started with a box. I rather work with a cube and then spherify it, because when you work with spheres in 3D Max, at the poles they have quads, they have triangles instead of quads, and they pinch when you apply modifiers to them, and that looks ugly. So start with a box, put several subdivisions on it. I have 10 by 10 by 10, and then apply a spherify. So now you have a sphere. But this sphere will have the seams, you can see them here. So apply a smooth modifier that gets rid of the seams. Then apply a noise, so it looks like it's handmade somebody, grabbed a bunch of clay and just bunched it together into a ball. And then I animated, if I hide the geometry, you can see that I animated a point. It's just moving forward and then it stops. And it's very important, if you see the curves, that the curves are linear, because remember, one of the things we're trying to fake, it's poor planning on the animation, and poor planning means no curves, linear animation. So the point is moving forward. At the same time, the lump of clay is just rotating, but I parented the clay to the point, so it just follows the point and it rotates on its own, but the combination of the two gives the illusion that it's rolling around. Finally, I applied a FFD space warp. Let me turn it on. There it is. It's that orange looking thing. And when I turn it on, I modified it. As you can see, I pulled the points in the bottom section apart from the center, and it looks as though the clay has some weight. And then I linked the FFD to the point as well, because if I don't, let's say it's not linked, then as soon as the sphere steps out, the effect is lost. So basically, I just linked the FFD to the point like that, and that gives the illusion of the clay kind of crawling. Let me just hide that so that you can see what I'm talking about, and hide the helper. And then at the end here, after it stops, I animated the space warp so that it goes back to normal, and then I animated a melt, which is turned off right here. So as soon as the FFD goes back to the cube shape, the lump of clay melts. And then I just applied a turbo smooth for good measure. As far as the material, I applied a grayish looking material. That's my experience. When you lump a bunch of clay, after a while it looks kind of like this color. And I googled fingerprint, and I got this map that I'm using as a bump map, so that it looks like people have been manipulating the clay. That's one of the other things that kind of gives away homemade stop motion animation. They don't clean up they don't have those professional clay figures that don't keep the fingerprints. And finally, the camera. Let me just unhide it. The camera motion, if you see the trajectory, is also, and if you see the curves, it's linear. So it just moves along at the same kind of rate. One last thing before rendering out and going into After Effects. It's always a good idea. Let's say you're going to be working at 640 by 480. You're going to want to render bigger than your actual final resolution. So I'm going to render 100 pixels more here, and I keep the image aspect at 1.3, and the computer will calculate the height. This is going to come in handy later on. So just go ahead and render your main path, which is the only one we'll use for this tutorial, and then we'll go into After Effects. So now we're in After Effects. So we'll take our main layer and drag it to the comp icon here, and it'll create a comp with the same characteristics as your footage, which is 740 by 555, 30 frames per second, 141 frames. Now I'm gonna press Control K, or if you're a Mac user, I think it's Command K, and I'm gonna name this lump of clay. And remember, if the idea is that our comp is going to be smaller than our actual footage, so I'm going to switch this to 640, and since we're keeping the aspect ratio 1.3, the computer calculates 480, which is okay. 640 by 480, and that's what we want. So as you can see, our footage is larger than our comp. Now, first thing first, I'm gonna go ahead and apply the regular color correction, just a little bit of curves here, just a little bit, not too much. I don't want it to go completely red, like that. As you can see, it's always better to contrast your footage just a little bit, maybe too much here. Okay, then we're gonna go and apply a new adjustment layer to sharpen the center of the image. New adjustment layer. And we're gonna name it Sharpen. Look for the sharpen effect in your effects and preset tab. Sharpen, and there it is. Just drag it in here and just give it a 10, maybe 15. Kind of brings it into focus. One thing I like to do is sharpen the center, and as you go away from the center of the image, the sharpen kind of fades away. So I'll just double click the ellipse tool and I get an instant mask, and I'm gonna exaggerate this so you can see the effect. No sharpen here, sharpen here. So select your adjustment layer, double click M to get all the mask settings, and give it a feather of, I don't know, 60, and then we'll shrink it just a little bit so that the focus of our image is in the center, and that's what's going to be more sharp and in focus. Now let's make it back to 15. If you click on this toggle mask button, you can hide your mask and see if you like the effect or not. So I'm satisfied with that. I'm going to add now blur to the top and the bottom of the comp. This will help the sharpen effect. Everything in the center is sharp, and towards the edges things should look blurry. I'm gonna hit Control Y if you're a PC user, or Command Y, I think, for Mac. Make a new solid. I'm gonna name it Top Bottom Blur, and hit this adjustment layer checkbox right here, and it becomes, your solid just became an adjustment layer. We're gonna add a blur, but not a Gaussian blur. I like this fast blur right here, because let's say you have a blur of 50. You can let me make the footage the size of the comp. If you apply a blur and your footage ends at the edge of the comp, you get this black stuff here. But with fast blur, you can click this checkbox, repeat edge pixels, and it'll get rid of it for you. But for now, let's go back to 100% scale here. Go back to your adjustment layer. I'm gonna make the blur 10, and I'm gonna put another mask so that I have blur on top and on the bottom. Just a very simple mask. Oops, wrong layer. Right here. Now we have the blur inside, so what we want to do is check this box where it says inverted, and now the blur is on the outside, but it's kind of abruptly ending here and here. Let me exaggerate it so that you can see what I'm talking about. See? So I'm gonna select my adjustment layer, hit M twice, and give it a feather of 50. Let's see if that looks okay. Maybe it's too much blur. Just go to 15, and maybe a bigger mask. Okay. So now we have our focus of the image in the center, kind of blurred at the top and at the bottom. Now we're going to be simulating the light variations that might happen from frame to frame on a stop motion animation that's kind of homemade. So we're going to add another adjustment layer, make a new solid, name it light variations, hit OK, make it an adjustment layer by clicking here, and now we're going to add a curves. So we're going to be animating this curve to simulate the light changing. So go ahead and click the little stopwatch right here so that whatever you move here is going to create a keyframe. So there's the stopwatch. If you press U on the layer that has animation, it'll show you whatever keyframes you have. So there we have curves. So just make random variations to this. Let's just go here and do a little variation there. Go here and make it here. Oh, I don't want that. Try not to exaggerate too much, but do go random and make several of these changes, no matter how minute they might appear to you. There we go. Now if we go ahead and preview this by pressing 0 on your numpad or clicking right here, you can see that one crucial detail is missing from these light variations, and that is they are occurring in a linear fashion, and they are supposed to be happening from frame to frame all of a sudden. So that's easily fixable. Just go ahead and select all of your keyframes for the curves, right click and go to where it says keyframe interpolation, and where it says temporal interpolation, on the drop down menu select hold and press OK. As you can see, they have changed appearance. If you preview this again, you can see that it's kind of a stepped key in that it changes abruptly. So this is more of kind of what we're going for. So now we're going to be simulating the camera position variations that might occur when making a stop motion animation. Let's say you're moving the lump of clay one frame at a time, and every time you go to move it, you press pause on the camera, you move the clay, you press pause again, and you press rec. And every time you do that, if it's not a professional camera, you're going to have slight position and rotation variations on your camera that are going to be very evident when you play back the final animation. So instead of applying these position variations to our main footage directly, we're going to be creating a new null object. Put it here in the bottom. it's not visible if it's on top. It's just for, you know, to have everything nice and tidy here. And we're gonna be naming it, go layer settings and name it position parent. So what we're going to do is apply some motion to this null object, and the null object will move our main footage. So select the main footage and look for this column where it says parent. If you don't have it, you're gonna have to click some of these buttons here on the bottom until you get it. So parent, select this, look at this squiggly line here. If you click and hold, you'll get a line, and just with that line select the position parent. As you can see, the parent is the position parent right here. So press P, select the parents, press P for position, you get X and Y, and if you move it around, the main footage will move along with it. That's what we want. So we're going to be giving this a very random motion, and we could just go ahead and the same way we did the light variations, you know, do it randomly by hand. But let's say if it's a very long animation, you don't want to be doing that all afternoon. So you can put a position key by pressing the stopwatch right here at the beginning, go to the end, make another one by clicking this little checkbox right here, and we got position keyframe here and a position keyframe here, and we're going to be using this window called the wiggler to apply random motion to our animation, which is basically no animation so far. We just need 2 keyframes. So if you select the position and hit and select the wiggler here and select apply, it'll apply a number of random keyframes that as a guide have these 2 settings, the frequency and the magnitude. Or if you scrub, you can see the edges of your actual comp, which is of your footage, which is bigger than your comp, kind of move around a little, but it's too subtle to be noticeable. So we're going to hit Control Z, select the position, and we're going to up the magnitude. So instead of 1, go ahead and click 3 and hit apply. So let's check it out. If you scrub, you can see the edges move a little bit more. But as you can see, since we rendered so big compared to our comp, we have a lot more to play with. So you can actually, you know, go to town and make the magnitude, I don't know, 8 or something, and you are still within the boundary. So we'll just keep it like this for now, although it might look a little bit exaggerated. So yeah, let's just go ahead and go to 4 and hit apply, and there we go. So we have the same problem as we did with the light variations, and that is these variations of position are happening continuously instead of from one frame to the next. So the same thing happens. Just go ahead and select all your keyframes, right click, keyframe interpolation, temporal interpolation drop down menu, select hold, click OK, and now they are happening from one frame to the next. Now if these are happening in a very uniform, timely manner, that'll change in the last step of this tutorial, so don't worry about it. But you can give the animation a little helping hand by, you know, randomly deleting some of them and maybe rearranging the timing a little bit so that it looks a little bit more random and man-made, let's say. There we go. And we're going to do the same thing. If you select your position parent, we already have the position displayed here. If you click Shift and hold and press R for rotation, you'll get the rotation track. Go ahead and do the same thing. Make a rotation keyframe at the beginning and a rotation keyframe at the end, and we're going to apply a wiggler to the rotation track. But here, you're gonna have to be very careful with the magnitude, because these are degrees and they will be more noticeable than the position. As you can see, it's moving quite a lot, and that's a bit too much. So for the rotation, I'm going to change the frequency to maybe, instead of 5 times per second, go 3 times per second, and the magnitude to just 1. Go ahead, click apply, and I think if you look at the boundaries when you scrub, I think that's a good enough variation without going overboard. So go ahead and select all your keyframes again, right click, keyframe interpolation, and make them hold. That way it happens from one frame to the next. And go ahead and give it that random look by maybe deleting a couple of them and changing the timing on some of the others. Try not to keep them at the same time, these, okay. Let me make a quick preview. There we go, I think. Now, the camera is moving continuously until the very last few frames, 25 frames or so, when the camera stops and the clay just drops down. So here it kind of doesn't look as good, so I'm gonna delete these few frames at the end here, so that when the camera is still, the quote-unquote mistake of moving the camera is less evident, because you're not moving the camera around. Okay, so now the final step in simulating homemade stop-motion animation is simulating the choppy motion of things. Since it's not planned ahead, you might have parts of the animation where the frame rate is 8 frames per second or 12 frames per second, and then all of a sudden you add more detail, so it's 24, and then all of a sudden it's back to 10 frames or something like that. So we're gonna add another adjustment layer. So new adjustment layer. Change the settings. We're gonna name it Posterize, because that's the effect we're gonna be using. So go ahead, we can get rid of the wiggler now. Let's go ahead and search here for an effect called Posterize, but not this Posterize, this one, Time Posterize. Go ahead and drag it onto your adjustment layer. And as you can see, it gives us just one setting, frame rate. Now our footage is rendered and interpreted at 30 frames per second. That's going to be very smooth. So what I want to do, a very choppy motion by making my whole comp, anything that's below this adjustment layer, so it's everything basically, a frame rate of 8 frames per second instead of 30. Now that's a big difference. If you preview the first 30 frames, you can see that already it's starting to look very choppy, crafty, handmade looking. But what I like to do is also keyframe this, so that the frame rate actually varies from time to time. When making the commercials that I mentioned at the beginning, this was very useful for parts where we really needed to show clearly an action by one of the characters. So we might be looking at maybe 12 frames per second, but then all of a sudden the characters was performing a certain action that we wanted to really show well. So I'll animate this to a 24 frames per second instead of 12, so it looks smoother. Hit the stopwatch, and the keyframes for posterized time are not allowed to be linear. They are already by default hold keyframes, so don't worry about that whole process again. And first we're gonna start with 8 frames per second, and then maybe here the person doing this animation started putting a little bit more effort into it, so we'll go to 20 frames per second and we'll keep it at 20. And then here he got tired again, so we'll go down to 12 and 12 frames per second. Maybe here switch back to 8, which is pretty bad. And then here 20 or whatever, you just put any number that you want, anything that makes sense to your animation. And then maybe here go to 24, because we're going to be performing this melt action and we want to add some detail to it, so 24 frames per second right before it collapses. So let's move this, maybe do a little more variation here. Let's go to 8 and let's change, oh, that's a 20, that's an 8, back to 24, and then it'll kind of melt there. And then here let's go back to 8 frames per second, and we're gonna preview to see if we like the result. Now as I'm looking at the preview, it actually looks very crafty, very amateur video. And what I like about the choppy motion is that it'll hold the footage long enough for you to see the fingerprint bump map that I added, so it looks kind of cool. A couple of things before ending the tutorial. First, you can animate the blur effect that we added at the top and at the bottom of the comp. This will simulate the cameras that you can find in most homes, that they try to automatically focus, and if you animate this blur, it'll simulate that camera not being very cooperative, which usually happens in these kinds of homemade projects. Also, one more thing, do not add motion blur to this, be it from your 3D program or in After Effects, because these kinds of stop motion animations do not have motion blur, because they are frame by frame. It's a series of photographs. So that's it for this tutorial. Have fun with this effect, and this has been Juan Duque for aetootsplus.com. See you next tutorial. Bye.